Hi, everyone, and welcome to the musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John's been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this here podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives. Difference makers who really make a difference.
And today we're talking with Melanie Kirkpatrick. Melanie's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. But that's not the reason we're talking with her today, right, John?
Right, Don. In fact, we're talking with Melanie today because she is the author of a book called Thanksgiving, the holiday at the heart of the American experience.
And more importantly, she's the author of the book Lady Editor, Sarah Hale and the Making of the Modern American Woman, which also has links to Thanksgiving. Thanks for being with us today. Speaking of Thanksgiving, Melanie Kirkpatrick.
Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you both, John and Don. And I think it's fair for me to speak for Sarah Hale and say she's happy to be here, too.
Terrific.
Now, why is Sarah so important to Thanksgiving, Melanie?
She's known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. And the reason that she has that nickname is because she's the one who encouraged the celebration of a national holiday. Before Sarah Hale got on the scene, the individual states would celebrate separately. The governor would name a Thanksgiving Day, and some states, even some governors didn't bother some years. But Hale was editor of Godey's Ladies book, which was the most widely read magazine of the pre-Civil War era in America. And she used that very powerful position to encourage a national celebration. And then separately, she would write to influence makers and encourage them to support her idea. And those influence makers included presidents of the United States. And because she was so influential, presidents wrote back. And they mostly said no. But in 1863, Abraham Lincoln took up her idea and named the first in the still continuing series of National Thanksgiving Days.
Now, the proclamation from Lincoln and from subsequent presidents didn't really, it kind of semi-established the holiday in the sense that the president would give a proclamation and people would follow his lead. But there wasn't anything formal to make it a national holiday until much later, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Lincoln established the tradition, and but the proclamations didn't have the force of law. And I should back up a minute and say that the reason that earlier presidents declined to call a National Thanksgiving Day was the Constitution of the United States. They believed, and they were probably right, that Thanksgiving is not mentioned in the Constitution. And they said that it wasn't the president didn't have the authority to tell Americans to celebrate a Thanksgiving Day on the same day. That was a prerogative that was left to the governors. And so Lincoln and the presidents who followed him did issue this proclamation, which was then taken up by the governors. And the governors would call a Thanksgiving Day. But then, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States and former governor of New York, had the temerity to change the date of Thanksgiving. The traditional date was always the last Thursday of November. But Roosevelt, who was a great president, in my view, when it came to World War II, but he was a lousy president, in my view, when it came to fighting the Depression. He had this dumb idea that if he called Thanksgiving for a week earlier than usual, that Americans would have more time to go Christmas shopping, and that would give a boost to the economy. Now, Americans didn't have the money, whether
Right.
it was, Thanksgiving the last Thursday of the month or the earlier Thursday of the month. So this idea was very controversial, with the result that half of the American states took up Roosevelt's idea and agreed to celebrate it on the last Thursday, earlier. But the other half of the states, so the governors, decided that they wanted to stick with the traditional date. And Massachusetts was the leader here because of the Pilgrims and the Indians in 1621, and they demanded the traditional day. With the result that you had, I should also mention Texas decided to celebrate both Thanksgiving days, which I thought was marvelous.
It's a big state,
It's a big state, right? But I'll tell you what happened. My mother was in college during those years. She was from Buffalo, and Buffalo was in New York State, which celebrated the Democratic Thanksgiving. That is Roosevelt's Thanksgiving. But she was going to college in Boston, which was a Republican state, and celebrated the original Thanksgiving. So for 4 years, she wasn't able to go home for Thanksgiving because she had to be at school. And then in 1941, Roosevelt admitted his mistake and said that henceforth Thanksgiving would be celebrated on the fourth Thursday of November. And Congress passed legislation to that effect. So starting in 1942, and ever since then, we've been celebrating on the fourth Thursday of November as a matter of law.
So really, the astonishing thing that we're uncovering today on the musical Innertube is that Thanksgiving, as we celebrate it, is a mere 80 years old. That it's really right. It's if the first one.
I never thought of it that way, John, but I guess if you want to be legalistic, are you a lawyer?
No.
He just dresses like one.
That's right. I pay intermittent attention. That's what I do. I really seize on things. But what's interesting is a lot about America is quite recent. We think of ourselves as this great established country. And you've just given us this really interesting story of a holiday that wasn't for a long time, or wasn't what it was going to be for an even longer time. And really, it's like the Pledge of Allegiance, which we think of as this great established thing, but it's actually only about, 60, not 60 years old. It's less than 100 years old,
Yeah, the 1940s, I think.
Right.
Well, you have a good point. To even elaborate on that, I would say, in my book on the history of Thanksgiving, I call it America's oldest tradition. And that really is what it is, a tradition. And it's a tradition that began before the Indians and the Native Americans. There's a chapter in my book in which I trace all the other European settlements or visitors to what they call the New World, and who celebrated Thanksgiving on our shore. And then, of course, the oldest Thanksgivings were those celebrated by Native Americans. And President Ronald Reagan was the first to acknowledge those Native Thanksgivings in the proclamation that his Thanksgiving proclamation in 1984, in which he quoted a Seneca Indian poem, a prayer. Pardon me.
There's a portion in the book that talks about people dressed like Spanish conquistadors marching into New England, saying, "We did it first," and the Puritans fighting back, quote unquote, because this was all a friendly rivalry, according to your book.
It was a great publicity
by saying,
stunt.
Well, we were the first Americans to do it,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that was a great publicity stunt. I think, what was the name of the governor of Texas at the time? Ann
Richards.
Ann Richards, yes, a very feisty woman. But there is a little town near El Paso where Spanish conquerors celebrated Thanksgiving a number of years before the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower. And so as a way to draw attention to their Thanksgiving celebration, as you mentioned, they dressed up as conquistadors and went to Plymouth, Massachusetts, and had a friendly fight, all prearranged, of course, with locals dressed as pilgrims. There was also another amusing episode that took place then during John F. Kennedy's administration. A state a senator, I believe, in the state of Virginia, objected to Kennedy's 1962, I think it was, proclamation, maybe 61, saying that Plymouth or Massachusetts was the site of the first Thanksgiving. And this Virginia state senator pointed to a Thanksgiving that took place earlier in what was known as Berkeley Plantation, and not too far from Richmond, I think. And that letter, so he wrote a letter to the White House complaining about this. And that letter landed on the desk of Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, man who went on to become the great historian of American history, but who then was working at the White House for Kennedy. Schlesinger looked into it and wrote back saying, "You're right," and promised that it wouldn't happen again. And sure enough, the next year, the Thanksgiving proclamation that Kennedy issued made reference to early Thanksgivings in Massachusetts and Virginia.
It's interesting, because as a holiday, the more I hear you talk, Melanie, the more I'm thinking that it's a funny holiday in a lot of different ways. First of all, the religious thing maps onto the patriotic thing. And I know some people, in fact, who are a little bit trifle uncomfortable with some of the religious origins, at least among the Europeans. And certainly the Indian tribes said Thanksgiving because they took seriously their relationship with the earth and what the earth had given them. And they, and then there's also the legislative history, right, of the holiday, which is a totally different thing, and the local history of the holiday, which teaches us that there have been a lot of Thanksgivings in our history, a lot of regional Thanksgivings, and now the whole idea was to have something we could call our own, to have a holiday that we could celebrate being here as a people, as a single people. And we find out, well, actually, it's a multiplicity of things.
Yeah, you're right. And of course, you've forgotten the culinary history too, which I found fascinating. And I devote a chapter in the book to the culinary history of the holiday. And there's also the history of football, which is tied with the history of Thanksgiving. And then perhaps most interesting to me was learning about the traditions of charity, of looking out for the poor, helping the less fortunate celebrate the holiday, and that's a very American tradition, I think, and very characteristically American. And it's not government coming together to make sure the less fortunate have a Thanksgiving dinner. It's individual churches, individual nonprofit organizations, and individual people. So the holiday has a profoundly rich history to it.
Can I ask a question about that culinary part? Why do we eat what we eat? I mean, I'm wondering how the turkey won out, quote unquote. Obviously, a lot of people have tofu for Thanksgiving. A lot of people have vegan and vegetarian Thanksgivings, and it all depends on what household you're talking about. But let's just talk about the history, and again, the multiple histories of Thanksgiving.
Well, the predominant point is that the holiday meal is centered around American foods, and the William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Plantation, writing in his great, great journal. If you haven't read it, I commend it to your attention, of Plymouth Plantation, talks about the 1621 event, now known as the first Thanksgiving. And he does mention the wild turkeys.
Uh-huh.
Now, so there were lots of other food there as well. The other food that we associate with the holiday is mostly native foods. And but one food that was very prominent early on, including in 1621, was venison. And I can't say I've ever encountered anybody today who eats venison for Thanksgiving dinner. But that was certainly in the 17th century much a part of Thanksgiving dinners. And the holiday, well, immigrants have brought their own food traditions to the holiday too.
Yeah. I was just going to say, anytime you brought down a deer, you probably said thanks. I mean, it was probably a major form of getting your protein, when you're.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The Native Americans, there were 90, all men, who attended what we know as the first Thanksgiving, roughly twice the number of pilgrims. And they brought with them 3 deer that they had killed. And that I got somebody, a hunter friend, to estimate for me how many meals could have come from that animal. And back then, of course, they would have eaten parts of the animal we wouldn't consider eating today. And I estimated that it would have fed the whole company for 3 days. That's how long the feast lasted anyway, we know. So, you're right. The venison was an important protein source.
And let's get back to football. I believe there's a spot in the book where you talk about William Bradford mentioning that there was fun and frolic at the first Thanksgiving, possibly even throwing a ball around.
Yeah, well, that's a stretch, but it's an appealing one to think that the Pilgrims and the Indians played football on the sand in Plymouth. But there is evidence, so I'm told, that Native Americans kicked a ball around for pleasure. So maybe. But it really, the modern form of football, by the 1880s, it was hugely popular around the country. Communities had football teams, high schools had football teams, and a tradition evolved that the championship game was played on Thanksgiving morning. So, and then by the early 20th century, when professional football teams began to be established, they also joined in on the idea of having a football game on Thanksgiving Day.
Yeah, the whole idea of the championship game, that is actually, I wouldn't say it's an American invention, but it is sort of an American thing. There's a lot of leagues in the world, especially soccer leagues, that you win your league, but there's not a game. In other words, you win the league by the most points at the end of like the Premier League in English soccer.
One of the objections to Roosevelt's decision to change the date of Thanksgiving in the 1930s came from universities that because they had scheduled their football championship games on Thanksgiving Day, and it was already on the calendar and it was too difficult to change. Calendar makers also objected to his change of date.
We'll get back to our Thanksgiving Innertube in just a bit, but first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Melanie Kirkpatrick is the author of many books, including Escape from North Korea, The Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad. On her website, she has links to groups who help refugees from North Korea.
You can view those links and learn more about Melanie, as well as contact her by checking out her website. It's Melanie Kirkpatrick. That's her name, MELANIEKIRKPATRICK, all one word, .com, MelanieKirkpatrick.com.
And now, back to the musical Innertube.
let's get back to Sarah Hale for a second, too, because she is a pretty powerful force in the 1800s, from the early to mid 1800s, as far as how we celebrate not just Thanksgiving, but how especially women go about their lives now. How did she get the editorship of that magazine, and how influential was it in daily American life?
Well, let me preface my comment by saying I think she is one of the most influential women in our history. And yet she is very little known, which is one reason I wanted to write her biography. She was from a little town in New Hampshire, came from a family that placed a high value on education. She was homeschooled by her mother, along with her brother, who, being a boy, got to go off to Dartmouth. And when he became of age, and he would come home and teach Hale everything he had learned at Dartmouth. So in a way, she's the first female graduate of Dartmouth, I like to think. She was one of the most highly educated women, American women, in the early part of the 19th century. And when her husband died, she married when she was 25. Very happily. She married a lawyer. They had 4 kids and a 5th on the way when her husband died suddenly. And the baby was born posthumously. Hale was left with these 5 kids and very little way of making a living. So she decided, I'm really truncating the story here, but
Sure.
She decided to try her hands at writing. And with the help of the Freemasons, her husband had been a prominent Mason, she was able to publish some of her poetry. And then she wrote a novel called Northwood, which was published in 1827, and it got very good reviews and was also published in London. It had an anti-slavery theme to it, and so it was 50 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So anyway, that book brought her to the attention of a man in Boston who was wanted to open a women's magazine. So he got in touch with Hale out of the blue, and she accepted, to the outrage of her friends who told her that no way could she succeed, and this was a terrible thing. But off she went to Boston, taking the baby with her and leaving the other 4 children with various relatives. The magazine was called the Ladies' Magazine. It was a very serious magazine. It was not, magazines were just really getting underway in America, and Ladies' Magazine was one of the first magazines to circulate nationally. And Hale believed, and now I'm getting to her theory of what a magazine should be. She believed that while America had been unified politically by the Revolution, the country was not unified culturally. And she set out to change that by publishing authors who wrote about America. Their poetry and their essays and their fiction had American themes. And this, believe it or not, from perspective of the 21st century, it would seem obvious that Americans want to read about American topics. But back then, that wasn't what magazines ran. They often stole articles from British magazines or from American newspapers and republished them in their own magazines, usually without credit, sometimes with credit. So Hale was an innovator in this sense. Well, her work came to the attention of Louis Goede, who was a fledgling publisher in Philadelphia. He wanted her to come to Philadelphia to edit his magazine. She didn't want to go to Philadelphia. Her 2 sons were at Harvard, and the other kids were nearby. And but Mr. Goede was very persuasive, and he ended up buying her magazine so that he could get her. And
the American way.
Yeah. The agreement was that she could stay till the boys graduated from Harvard, and then off she went to Philadelphia, where she lived for the remaining 40 years of her life. And with Mr. Godey's great publicity skills behind the magazine, she made it into the most widely read magazine of the pre-Civil War era. It had a huge circulation for the day, up over 100,000 subscribers, and every magazine had, one would guess, at least 5 other readers beside the subscribers. So it circulated in every state and in the territories. So her influence was enormous. And let me just mention briefly a few of the kinds of things that she influenced. The biggest one was education for women. As a highly educated woman herself, she valued women's education. At the time that her magazine, 1828, began, there wasn't a single institute of higher education that admitted women in the United States. Half of American women were illiterate. And she used her magazine to push for the establishment of higher education for women, but also to change Americans' ideas about why women should be educated. So she was very influential there. She also believed that Americans could be unified in, I guess I would say, kind of the lower end of the cultural scale, such as cooking. She was the first editor to publish recipes. She's established a recipe section in Godey's Ladies book, which meant that Americans all around the country were cooking the same foods and usually using American-grown ingredients. So, and then there were other just quirky things that caught her eye. She was a big fan of Queen Victoria. And when Queen Victoria was married, 1840, I think, she was married in a white wedding gown, which was unusual. And Hale loved the idea, took it up, and started encouraging American women to wear white wedding gowns. And sure enough, I wore white on my wedding day, and a lot like many American women. And the Christmas tree was another one of the topics she took, cultural ideas she took up, and she promoted that in the pages of Godey's Ladies book as well.
As a poet, by far her most famous poetical work, I think, was Mary Had a Little Lamb. I mean, I can't believe all the things this lady did that she got into.
Yeah. She was well known for her poetry. She published hundreds, if not thousands, of poems, and it's very, very good. It's not of the top quality, I would say, but it's extremely good. And it was a poetry reading age. People loved poetry. And Mary Had a Little Lamb was published in 1830. She wrote a lot for children, actually, and she believed that juvenile literature should be both fun for the kids and carry a moral message. And if you go back and read the entire poem of Mary Had a Little Lamb, we really just know the opening stanza, but there were 3 stanzas originally. And in the 3rd stanza, her moral message becomes clear. She's encouraging children to be kind to animals.
Going back to what you were talking about of female education, she had a hand in a guiding hand, I would suppose, in starting Vassar College. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. She and Matthew Vassar, Matthew Vassar was the one who put up the money and had the idea for Vassar, had a prolific correspondence, which is fascinating to read as she describes what she thinks is important in establishing Vassar, which was intended to be a kind of female equivalent of an Ivy League college, highly academic. And so one thing she pushed and was successful at was persuading Vassar to hire women as professors. The trustees, before the college was open, thought, no, there are not any women who are sufficiently capable. But yes, there were, because women had been going to college since around the 1840s, and Hale helped introduce these women to Vassar. So she also was a big advocate of women becoming doctors, and she supported Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to receive a medical degree. And she supported the establishment of medical colleges specifically for women. She had an interesting idea, though. She wasn't, she was a feminist from my perspective, but in the context of her age, she thought that women were by nature suited to become doctors. And she wanted women to be, to treat women and children, and men could be left to male doctors. But she believed, I guess, in that separation of the sexes, because she thought, it makes sense in the context of the day, where women were often, what's the word? Modest about having male doctors treat them. So
That's true.
Now, so
Yeah. Was she much of a suffragette? Did she want the vote?
no, just the opposite. She, this is of course before the suffragette movement took off, but she did not support votes for women. In fact, she had an interesting idea. She thought that women were of a higher moral character than men, and that they would be more effective in the political sphere, advising the men in their families and the men they knew, so that because men were, deep in the rough and tumble of politics, and politics, like back then, like today, was a nasty business. And she really thought the country needed women who could remind the politicians about, kind of the higher, more important values in life. So at the end of her life, she lived to be 91, I think. She I won't say she was beginning to change her mind, but I like to think that had she lived 20 more years, she would have come around to the idea of women voting. But at the end of her life, she thought that women should run for election to school boards, and supported that idea. And that, of course, women voting for and running for positions on school boards was one of the early beginnings of the suffragette movement.
This is an amazing unsung person who was absolutely crucial in a couple of dozen ways to our national identity and our national culture. And one of the things I love about your book is that it shows you just how many things she was able to influence in the course of her life. And this is all after she had 5 kids. I mean, it's just astonishing to think about.
You mentioned the magazine gave direction to Americans on how to live their lives, but it also did open up a lot of room for American authors. The authors that she picked well before the Saturday Evening Post and all of the other literary magazines, The Atlantic and all those others, she was publishing American authors way before those other magazines.
She was a very good judge of literature. And she, I think she's one of the first to publish Edgar Allan Poe. She also published Nathaniel Hawthorne. And then there were many other writers whose names are forgotten to us today, but were well known back then. She also sought out and published many, many, many female authors, including Lydia Segurdi, who was a prolific and famous poet of the day, and Harry Beecher Stowe, who wrote travel essays and other pieces of prose for her. She helped to develop the literary culture in a way that I think was very important to the development of our national literature.
Well, she seems to have been Superwoman before that term was coined. So thanks for the information on Sarah Hale. And then, of course, her campaign to establish Thanksgiving worked spectacularly, as we're all going to be sitting down in a few days to big mounds of turkey and mashed potatoes. Thanks very much, Melanie, for all the information, and happy Thanksgiving to you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to both of you as well. And I hope you will give a thought to Mrs. Hale when you tuck into your turkey.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Check out our website at musicalinnertube.com, where you'll find all our episodes, profiles of our guests, and lots of extras. You'll even be able to leave us a voicemail.
Our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. On Twitter, our handle is MInnertube. Capitalize the M and I.
The Innertube is available on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iHeartRadio podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.